procedure. And
Good afternoon, everyone. Please find your seats. Okay, I know you are having so much fun talking to your neighbors right now. We are going to stop fun briefly. You will have plenty of time over the next 36 hours, though, to form new friendships and renew old friendships. So welcome to the beginning of the 62nd Annual Diocesan Convention of the Episcopal Diocese of Arizona. For those who haven't met me, I'm your Bishop Jennifer Ruddall, and it is such a joy to be here today. I would invite you to stand as you're able for the land acknowledgement and opening prayer. I would like to acknowledge the Tohono O'odham people, the traditional custodians of the land on which we are meeting today. I acknowledge that they have occupied and cared for this land over countless generations, and I celebrate their continuing contributions to the life of this region. And for our opening prayer today, last Sunday, Sigrid Maitrogene gave me the prayer book of Pat Maitrogene, who was a priest who died about a year and a half ago, his 1928 BCP, in which he had marked all of the prayers that he liked. And one of those prayers was the prayer to be used at the meetings of convention. Remember, this is 1928, but I thought it was a good prayer for us to start today. So let us pray. Almighty and everlasting God, who by thy Holy Spirit didst preside in the council of the blessed apostles, and hast promised through thy Son, Jesus Christ, to be with thy church to the end of the world. We beseech thee to be with the council of thy church here assembled in thy name and presence. Save us from all error, ignorance, pride, and prejudice. And of thy great mercy vouchsafe, we beseech thee, so to direct, sanctify, and govern us in our work by the mighty power of the Holy Ghost, that the comfortable gospel of Christ may be truly preached, truly received, and truly followed in all places to the breaking down of the kingdom of sin, Satan, and death, till at length the whole of thy dispersed sheep, being gathered into one fold, shall become partakers of everlasting life through the merits and death of Jesus Christ, our Savior. Amen. Amen. Please be seated. I do have one final prayer if Eleanor and Charles Webb are here. Are they? All right, well then you're going to receive this blessing on behalf of both of you. Today is Charles and Eleanor Webb's 50th wedding anniversary. And I know there is nowhere that anyone would rather spend their 50th wedding anniversary than at a church convention. So let us pray for them on this anniversary. O gracious and ever-living God, you have created us in your image. Look mercifully on this man and this woman who have come to you seeking your blessing, and assist them with your grace, that with true fidelity and steadfast love, they may continue to honor and keep the promises and vows they made. Through Jesus Christ, our Savior, who lives and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen.
Thank you.
So I now invite our new events coordinator. Well, she's not new anymore. It's just time is weird. Tony Murdoch, would you come up here and give us our housekeeping announcements?
Yeah, I'm not new. Last year, my second event was Diocesan Convention. So, as many of y'all already know, we have restrooms that are outside both sides of the ballroom, down near Presidio, and then right over here in front of Coronado. So if you have not located those, we will have the volunteers in their blue vests, which many of them are getting to participate today in the keynote. So you'll find them. They can help you locate them. And if you do not have a map, we still have some at the registration desk. There are water coolers. Y'all might have also seen those. In all the meeting rooms, we have a few different ones set up over here. In this one, since this is our main room we will be in. Visit the exhibit hall in Coronado if you haven't already, which is the room directly down the hall to our right. There's a bingo game, so be sure to pick up the bingo card as you enter the exhibit hall. Visit each booth to fill it out. Turn in your full card and get a prize. Prizes include Dio merch and candy. Evening prayer will be held tonight in Agave, the smaller of the Agave rooms. So if you go right out the ballroom door to the left, you will see it there, and there will be a sign to help navigate, and of course wayfinders to help as well. Tonight we have a reception that was supposed to be out these doors all the way down the hall. That has been moved because some landscapers they stripped the area more than they were supposed to. So we got moved, but it's more convenient for us because it's now in the Presidio foyer. So if you go out to the left, you will be able to go down there. There will be some cocktail tables set up inside and outside on the beautiful balcony where we will get to see the beautiful sunset. Perfect timing, pretty good weather today. So we will still have a chance to enjoy a nice reception. So that also means that our 12-step gathering for anybody who wishes to join in that has also been moved. It is now in the bigger of the Agave rooms, which is, again, right out the door to the left. There is a sign that will be there as well. So y'all don't have to go all the way down there, out the doors to the other reception hall. Definitely go check out the pool area because the mountains are beautiful, but it's a little more convenient for us to have it in the Presidio foyer. And then, so those are at 5:30. And then again at dinner time, it's 6:30, and we will be back in here. There will not be assigned seating, and I know some churches had already started assigning their tables. I have your name tags, so you can reassign yourselves at dinner so you can claim a table for your church at dinner. And so that is at 6:30. The blue star sticker on your name tag means that you paid for dinner and registered for dinner. If you do not have a blue star and you want a blue star, you will come see me at the registrar desk immediately outside the ballroom, and then I'll send you over to our finance department to make sure we get you paid squared away. So around 6:15, if you have any disabilities or need a little extra time at the buffet, please head to the doors around 6:15, and we will make sure that you have all the help you need. And there is plenty of food and seating. You do not need to crowd around the doors. And we ask for safety. Please do not save seats by folding them over. We have plenty of spare paper. Come find me. I will give you some spare paper. Y'all can write your church's name down. Like place a napkin over it or a jacket if you want to save a seat. Just don't bend the seats down because that can get a little dangerous. Tomorrow morning, breakfast is on your own. The hotel has a few different options that we got to enjoy this morning. The Sundance Cafe opens up at 6:30. Grab and go with the breakfast and snacks that are available from 6 a.m. to 11 a.m. They have Starbucks coffee. And, of course, room service that begins at 7 a.m. Then we will have morning prayer back over in Agave in the Daughter of the King Chapel at 8:30 tomorrow. And then, finally, lunch tomorrow will be available around noon, so that's going to be in between our convention break, like our business meeting break. We'll start the business meeting, take a break, have lunch, and then we'll come back and reconvene. But those are going to be for all those who pre-registered for convention. If you did not pre-register, we may not have enough food for you, just because I had to order with the numbers that I had. And I said finally, but I want to say one more final thing. We have Spanish translators. And yes, so if you need Spanish translation, or you know of any guests who are just wandering around waiting for us to tell them where to go, we have Spanish translators back there. They are excellent. They've been so kind to come back all the way down to Tucson from Phoenix. So please take advantage of that. We have headphones for the business meeting, Eucharist, everything. We want to make sure that everybody feels included and prepared to share in the fellowship we are having. I think that is all for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. And I also need to announce that the offering at Eucharist tomorrow is going to be dedicated to our veteran and military service ministry. But wait, I want to tell you more before you clap. They have a table in the exhibit hall, and I'm sure they would love for you to go over to the table at the exhibit hall and talk with them. If your congregation does not have a ministry for veterans, this is a great chance to go learn about it and maybe start one. And tomorrow is a great opportunity for you to give to help, particularly our missioner for military and veteran ministry, Laura Adelia, as she drives hither and yon all over the diocese, meeting with congregations that either have a ministry or are looking to start one. So thank you to everyone who's come from that ministry today. Now you can clap. And now I'm very excited to introduce our keynote speaker today. The Reverend Isaiah Shaneequa Brokenleg is an enrolled member of the Rosebud Sioux Tribe for the Sicangu Nation. She is an Episcopal priest in the Diocese of South Dakota. From a cultural perspective, she believes that we are all related, and as such, we are all called to be good relatives to one another. As a winktè, Lakota Two-Spirit, Shaneequa is called to be a healer and move communities in the direction of positive change. From an academic perspective, she has a Master's of Public Health degree from the University of Minnesota and a Master's of Divinity degree from the Church Divinity School of the Pacific. Shaneequa is the staff officer for racial reconciliation at the Episcopal Church. She's passionate about social justice and working to end the structural oppression and violence that hurts us all. Shaneequa strives to live out her calling through her work, our church, her art, and her life. And Shaneequa, it is a joy to have you here today. Thank you. Come on up.
Hello, everybody. It's great to be here. I'm a little nervous. Let me just take a deep breath. I bring you greetings on behalf of our presiding bishop and his Reconciliation, Justice, and Creation Care team, and it's great to be here. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about some stuff, and then we're going to do what it says table time. We're going to do a little bit about storytelling. And if you if you have a question or something, stand up or make a noise or something, or you can ask me later at dinner. This is a picture of buffalo in South Dakota. I understand that you all have these creatures here that I thought were pigs, but they're called javelinas, right? And they're dangerous, probably just like buffalo. So anyway, and the theme is reconciled in Christ. Did anybody else find it ironic that we're at a place named El Conquistador when we're talking about reconciliation? Okay, I was like, Anyway, so obviously, if nothing else, we can talk about that. Okay, perfect. All right. So I'm Lakota, so I understand I guess, words a little differently from our language. And we have this word wo Lakota. And sometimes this word can mean peace, but it also can mean it's the state when all things are in right relationship. So if you are in right relationship with yourself, with each other, with the Creator, and with creation, that's what wo Lakota means. And that wo at the beginning of the word means it's an action. It means it's not something that's just going to happen on its own. And it means that we have to do something to make it happen, right? And growing up, that's a concept or an idea that we had. And I like to liken it to, there's a Jewish word that often gets translated as righteousness, and I kind of think of it that way. There's another, so you didn't realize you're going to get a Lakota language lesson, but there's a few of these in here, so just bear with me. This other one is really important, and the phrase is mitakuyo yasi, and it means we are all related, or all my relatives, or God bless all my relatives. And it's what we say when we end a prayer. And when we say we and relative, we're not just talking about people, but we're talking about all of creation. So like plants and animals, the mountains, all of that. And growing up, I was taught that the overarching message of the gospel is that we are called to be good relatives. And all throughout Jesus's ministry, that's what Jesus did, built relationship and reminded people that they are related to one another and related to the earth. Okay. And somewhere along the way with our church, we have had a problem where our church, at least parts of our church, have wandered away from that idea. And I liken it to the prodigal son. I'm sure you know this story. I think it's Luke 15. I'm not a Bible expert, but we understand that story, right? There's like the one son and took the shared family resources and left, and I think it says squandered them in dissolute living. And that's kind of what I think pieces of our church have done, right? Our church got tied up in power and empire and greed, and that resulted in this broken relationship. And sorry, I like to wander around. I hope you don't get dizzy, but and that broken relationship in our church looks like some things, right? It looks like the doctrine of discovery. It looks like colonization. It can look like slavery and our participation in it, in which, slavery did build lots of our churches, or boarding schools and our participation in that. It can look like racism. And in some of our communities, it can look like shadeism or colorism, where we might look at certain folks who are lighter or darker differently, right? And we might wonder how this happened. Aside from being tied up in power and empire and greed, there's two things that I want to talk about. One is this classic theological question, and it was asked by the church very early on. Must one become a Jew before they can become a Christian? That was the question. And Paul wrote some letters that we read sometimes, and to answer that question, right? And Paul said, no, you don't have to become a Jew before you become a Christian. You can just be a Christian. And somehow, our church, as it was spreading the gospel, has forgotten that. And somehow our church mistakenly thought that we have to become white before we can become a Christian. And you could spread that out a little further, and sometimes our church thinks you have to become straight before you can become a Christian. Or sometimes our church thinks you have to become cisgendered before you can become a Christian, or maybe able-bodied before you can become a Christian, or maybe have to look or dress a certain way, and the list could go on, or maybe be a male before you can become a Christian. And that happened, I think, because of what I'm going to show you next. Okay. So, everybody with me still? I'm kind of, okay. And so I talk a little bit quickly, so I apologize to the translators. If you need me to slow down, let me know. All right. I remember doing a presentation in Canada, and they were doing like English and French, and I was like, and going on, and it was a little, I looked over, and they were like, no, we got this. Okay. The other problem that we have was white Jesus. And I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with white Jesus. I'm sure white Jesus is in a lot of our churches. I'm sure you've seen white Jesus. Here's how white Jesus came about. White Jesus actually came about for a really good reason, right? One of the wonderful things about God is that God became incarnate and became one of us and came down to be amongst us and have that human experience, right? And came in, of course, the person of Jesus, who was actually a brown person. But because of that incarnation, we all want to have a Jesus that looks like us, right? That is one of us. And so as that gospel was spreading, we get Jesus in all different sorts of ethnicities, right? We have like a Russian Jesus and an African Jesus and an Asian Jesus, and we also get a white Jesus. And so that's okay. The problem is when the church, forgetting about Paul, thinking that we need to become white before we can become a Christian, perpetuated that white Jesus and pushed it on the people that was colonizing and didn't allow us to have a Jesus that looked like us. And so the Jesus that we saw was the white Jesus. And when we try and lift up a brown Jesus or a native Jesus or a Jesus that looks like us, we got told, no, that was bad, or no, that was wrong, or no, that's not what Christianity looks like. You can't sing in Lakota. That's the devil's language. Your way of honoring God is not okay, right? And that's where all of that gets tied up in. And so when we have to realize and sort of open our brain and think outside and know that just like in Paul's time, the ways that Romans would celebrate and have a celebration, what Eucharist looks like for them, is going to be different than the ways the Jewish folks would celebrate and have a Eucharist, right? They're thinking Seder, and Romans are thinking party with lots of alcohol, right? And so Paul had to actually write a whole letter about that. And the same is true here. We need to remember that our tradition, our Christianity, even our Episcopalian Christianity is going to look different, right? Growing up, I thought the Episcopal Church was the Indian church because I was on a reservation. And we had beaded stuff when we had church, and we sang in Dakota, and all of those things. And the other funny thing, sorry, I'm going to tell you this joke. My grandpa was an Episcopal priest, and on the reservations, we used something called Indian Health Service. The government, when we gave up our land, promised us free health care. It does a terrible job of it. But Indians call it IHS, Indian Health Service. On all the churches, they have a IHS on the lectern and on the altar, and in my mind, I was like, oh, the Indian Health Service cares about our physical health and our spiritual health. I'm getting way sidetracked. I'm sorry. I'm going to tell one more story about this, though. It all made sense in my head. Okay, my grandma, she's diabetic. Diabetes is a problem in a lot of different communities. And we always worried about her blood sugars and her A1C hemoglobin, which is an electrolyte level. And I understood that electrolytes help move things around the body to help keep her healthy. And it wasn't until college that I learned that I was an acolyte and not an electrolyte. Because I helped my grandpa move things around the altar area to help with church. It all made sense in my head. So that idea, when we have white Jesus, also gives us this new thing called righteousness. This is not my word. Somebody else came up with it. How many have heard of righteousness? Anybody? A few of you. Okay. It's this way that we subtly perpetuate whiteness as goodness, or also the idea of maybe triumphalism in our church, specifically colonization, doctrine of discovery, that kind of triumphalism. And so I have some examples of righteousness here that I want to share with you. This first one is not a church-related one, but this comes from, by all accounts, the best technical college in the United States. Obama visited it twice. It's located in South Dakota. This is their advertisement. And some people looked at it, and obviously the people who created it looked at it and didn't see the racism that was inherent in this advertisement. what do folks notice? What might some of the problems be? Okay, yeah, we got blue eyes, right? Only blue eyes. And the bottom it says, get the look of success. So if you want to be successful, you must have blue eyes, right? Anyway, I pointed that out to them. They didn't really want to change their advertisement. I'm sure they paid somebody a lot of money to think of this advertising scheme. Anyway, Lake Area Tech, the best. Anyway, okay. Here's another example. This one I see on Facebook sometimes, and I always point it out. Example of righteousness. We have, sometimes you don't even see or realize what God is doing for you, and here we have the brown people as the bad people, right? And then the angels, of course, are white. This is another example of righteousness. Here's another one. And what's interesting is we don't always catch this. We don't recognize this as a problem. And if you see this and don't see that there's a problem, talk to some of your neighbors and figure out what's going on here. And it's really important why we, in our hymnody, in our prayer book, and all the things that we do, we need to question these things. I don't know if any of you, it's not in our hymnal anymore, but it used to be. Trying to remember the name of it. From Greenland's Icy Mountains. What the heck is that hymn? It's a terrible hymn. But anyway, it very all about colonialism and propagates it. I can't remember the name. Anyway, okay, I'm going to move on. One story that I remember hearing about from an elder, she was in boarding school, and they had this picture on the wall that had a stairway, and it was heaven, and then, hell, and there was the people climbing, and there's like nuns and priests and lay people climbing on this ladder to get to heaven, and all the brown people, the natives people, were all falling off the ladder and going into hell. And I remember she said that she prayed to become white, and it was the prayer that God didn't answer for her. But it's things like that that perpetuates these systems, and we don't always recognize or see how that is. And if you have a white Jesus in your church, question it. What kind of message does it send? Who's at your church? Who's going to see that? What are they going to think about it? Are we lifting up other ideas of what Christ could look like? And if we're so busy seeing the white Jesus, we will fail to see Jesus in the black and brown faces of the people around us, right? Okay. And when we fail to see Jesus in the people around us, we can no longer spread the gospel, right? Okay, let me move on. How many of you heard of historical trauma? Okay, most of you, okay. So Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart is, I can't remember if she's a psychologist or a social worker, but she's got her PhD. Thank you. And she talks a lot about this. This is her definition. But I like to use a visual. So in a healthy society, one generation passes on what I like to consider their cultural DNA to the next generation. All those things you learn from your aunties and uncles and grandmas and grandpas that tell you things like, how do you resolve conflict? What are our concepts of gender? Maybe even what religion are we? Maybe even, what constitutes a Thanksgiving dinner? Maybe are we Packer fans or Viking fans? I don't know what sports teams you have here, but that kind of stuff. And so even though those first generations are gone, generations to come still have that same cultural DNA. That's how it's supposed to work, right? Well, sometimes some things happen that interrupt that cultural DNA transformation. This was in my social studies book as a kid. And it's Balboa executing Native people. What most people don't know about this is he's actually executing Two-Spirit people. Two-Spirit people meaning LGBT indigenous folks. Because they were often looked to as spiritual healers or leaders, and so it's kind of like you get killed two birds with one stone. In our situation, we have boarding schools, and these are Chiricahua Apache children entering boarding school, and they just got off a 3-day train ride on the left, and it's those same children 4 months later. And what I like to tell people, or what I want you to be mindful of, is every single thing that kid has on means something, right? Means something. The fact that one has a bandana around his head, that probably means that he went through the rites to be considered an adult. The way they wear their hair means something, just like here, right? That purple shirt that she has on, that means something. Those collars that some of you have on, that means something. John, where are you? Are you in here, John? I know you're in here. Somewhere John's here. There we go. he has this medallion on. That means something, right? When we take away those things, we take away one's identity and who they are, and that's what we did to these children. And so with historical trauma, something interrupts that cultural DNA transmission. For Indigenous people, it was government policies and boarding schools, but historical trauma exists for lots of different folks. And so you have a generation that's missing that information. And so they're going to pass on all of that loss of religion, language, death, adoption, genocide, all of that. And so even if the boarding schools aren't here anymore and the government policies have gotten better, that negative stuff can get passed on again. And so that's where you see that suicide and violence, hopelessness, fear, shame, all of that stuff. And so sometimes people will ask me, you know, Shaneequa, that happened so long ago, why can't y'all just get over it? Slavery was so long ago, why can't y'all just get over it? This is why. I don't know if you know a lot about medicine. Maybe there's a couple medical people in here. It's kind of like a cancer, right? A cancer is you have a cell and just keeps replicating this bad DNA and, you know, you get tumors. And that's kind of what happens with historical trauma. It will continue until healing is done. And we might have to ask ourselves as a church who participated in some of this historical trauma and caused some of it, how are we going to participate in the healing? How are we going to make it better? And if we talk about reparations, what do those look like? Because it's not always money. How are we building relationships, and how are we providing healthy environments for folks, and how are we ensuring that this healing is taking place so that generations to come won't have the same historical trauma? What are some other examples of historical trauma? One more time. Gender violence, thank you. That's not on my list, but thank you. Holocaust, slavery, survivors of war, thank you. That's probably a lot of what I have. Forced migration, intergenerational poverty, Japanese internment, child separation at our border, HIV/AIDS with the LGBT community. And here are some of the symptoms, right? Historical and generational trauma, you could have one, all of these, some of them. The one that's important to keep in mind is where it says discomfort around certain people. If you come into Indian community and you're a clergy, you have to really be careful because you are representing an institution. Just like if you come into the LGBT community, you are representing an institution, right? And they're not going to see you as Jennifer or Shaneequa. They're going to see you as a member of this institution. And it will take time for you to develop the relationships that are needed before you can build true relationship, right? And relationship moves at the speed of trust. Let me check my time, okay. So y'all remember the story of the prodigal son? At least I hope you know this story. So in the story, right, the prodigal son leaves and takes all of the shared resources, right? And that's kind of some of what the church did. I think it was Bishop Tutu who said, white people came to Africa and the missionaries came and they said, close your eyes and let us pray. And before that, they had the Bible and we had the land. So we closed our eyes to pray, and when we opened our eyes, they had the land and we had the Bible. And if we think about that story, right, the son takes the family resources, his inheritance, and that's kind of what the church did too. Minerals, land, people. But then in the story, right, there's a time where the son, famine hits, and the son's like feeding the pigs and wants to eat the pods. He's feeding the pigs and is like, I need to come back home. I think our church is beginning to realize that what's happening is not sustainable. The way we have been church is not sustainable. Well, and it's not really of God either. But anyway, let me move on. And so we have to kind of figure out what's going to happen. And I think I'm talking now to people of color and other people who've been harmed by the church, we have to decide, are we going to be like the brother in that story and not come into the house because we're angry? Or how are we going to also take part in that reconciliation? What is our role in there, and what are we willing or not willing to do in that role? That's a whole nother question, deeper thought, right? What does that reconciliation look like? Okay. Anybody have anything to say about that? Sorry. Okay. So our church has lifted up this vision for racial healing and reconciliation and justice. And I'm going to just read this quote from our presiding bishop. Our calling is to learn and face the truths of our participation in historic manifestations of racism, white supremacy, and ways of being that have put down, hurt, harmed any children of God because of their race, color, and ethnicity. Then our calling is to do the work of active repentance that is not wallowing in guilt, but is about learning from the mistakes of our past. Then we turn and do everything we can to right old wrongs, to repair the breaches, to close the chasms that separate us from each other, and to work together to build new structures, socially and relationally, that lead us toward transformation and reconciliation. Hopefully you all have seen this before. Okay. What do you notice about a labyrinth, or how do you liken this work to a labyrinth, besides that there's 4 quadrants? But it's not a direct route. Thank you. I was hoping somebody would say that. Our church seems to think reconciliation is a direct route sometimes, or people in our church are like, oh, let's just throw money at it and say we're sorry and it's going to be over, right? That's not how that works. And the other thing I like to notice is, at the very beginning of this little path, you get really close to the center, or you think you're really close, and yet you have a long way to go, right? And the same is true with this work. There's no dead ends. That's also a very, very good option, or a very good comment. So I'm going to use the example of my sending parish in Wisconsin, St. Matthias. Their church is in the white border town, which is near a reservation. Border towns are typically very racist. I think I was the only person of color that went to church there. And they're like, we need to do some work with this reservation. It's only like 10 miles away. And actually, most of the people that go to that church actually live on the reservation. And they're like, and we need more children, because the average age at this congregation was about 70 years old. And they're always complaining about how we don't have a lot of children. We need to get some. So we did a Native American service, and we invited folks from the reservation, and we had food and all the things. And that first year, we had about 3 folks from the reservation come. And a lot of other folks came, and it was very popular. And then we did it again the next year, and we had about 25. The next year, we had about 50, and we had a lot that were coming. And then we started to do it quarterly. And that's when problems started to happen. Because it wasn't during Thanksgiving when everybody wants to think about it. They're like, oh, how is this Native American worship service going to interfere with our Advent? We're not going to, we can't sing the same songs if we're, And I was like, well, we're going to light the same Advent wreath. We're going to say the same prayer. We're going to have a Eucharist. And people just, their hackles kind of calm down after a little while. And same thing too, same thing with Lent. Oh, how is it going to be Lent if we have this Native American service? Anyway, and then the other thing that came up that was interesting is folks wanted the Native folks to come, which they did, but guess what? They are not affluent like a lot of the people who come to this church. So that meant that there were cars that sometimes didn't run in our parking lot, and people got mad because there's these ugly cars, and who's going to want to come to church if they look in the parking lot and see ugly cars? And of course, we as the Native population have lots of babies. And so that meant there were children in church, which is what they said they wanted, but then, oh no, the children are being too noisy, and they're running around and nobody's watching them. And I'm like, well, in our culture, everybody's watching these children. They might be over there and their parents might be over here, but any auntie or grandma can yell at them if they're misbehaving. That's just how it works in Lakota culture. I got yelled at by plenty of aunties and grandmas growing up. And so it's like this process that you have to figure out. And then the church started to think about how can we not just invite folks to come to our building, but how can we go out and interact in the community? And then we started to do more reconciliation work on the reservation. The rector went to the school and was reading to some of the younger kids, and there was a lot of different cross things that were happening. And I think that's kind of about that time when I went to seminary. But what I'm trying to say is it's a process. It's not an event. And here you are engaging in this process, and I don't know where you're at. You're probably all at different places on this labyrinth. And so this is just my little model, but I think there's not just one road that gets you there. There's plenty of different ways to get there, and it's going to be unique to you. So I get a lot of phone calls, and people are like, we did that sacred ground thing. What do we do next? I'm like, well, that depends on your context. What's going on in your community? And my answer is usually always, how are you building relationships outside of your building? Do people even know that you exist there? You know, what businesses are around a 2-block radius of your building, and do they know who you are? So we always like to think we can move from broken relationship to reconciliation, and there's this process that has to take place, that middle section, apology, lament, and reparations. And there's 2 sort of schools of thought that I want to mention here. One is reconciliation, which implies that at one time we had conciliation, right? And in my Lakota cultural understanding, at the beginning when God created us, we all were reconciled. So I, of course, follow that one. And other folks have reckoning, which is like we didn't have conciliation from the beginning of the moment when colonization happened. That was not that was not conciliation. And so we can't just have reconciliation. We need to get through reckoning and get there. So just keep that in mind. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to skip over this, but through how do we build that state of right relationship? And the biggest key that I want to leave you with is it's through connection, relationship, building relationship. And that can happen through conversations and storytelling, which I'm going to move into. The next few things that I want to talk about are just some skills to give you as you're doing this work. And so we're going to do a little activity, and on your tables is this power flower, and I would like to apologize to everyone who does not speak English. The power flower is in English, and I will, when I return, ask for it to be translated so we have a version in Spanish, and for that matter, French. When we do this work, it's important to think about the power we have. And I've done presentations about anti-racism, and people are like, well, what about gender? What about LGBT stuff? What about whatever, insert thing here. And this kind of helps us to be thinking about that and how power comes into play. And so what I'd like you to do is look at this, and I think the example I use is gender here. So we're only going to do one of these, but later on, as you're going through your weekend or taking this home, Tony will send this out to you as a PDF so you can use it in your churches. Let's take a look at gender, and I'd like you to think about, as with regards to gender, which gender has primary power in our society, or at least in your context where you are, and write that on the outside. On the outside, so I put it up here. You could look on the thing. So I put down cisgendered men. So for my context, cisgendered men are the ones who have power. Okay. And then what I'd like you to do is from the center of the flower to the edge, color in how much power you think you have when it comes to gender. So for me, for example, I'm Two-Spirit, so I don't identify as a man, although I'm very male presenting. And so I think society gives me a lot of power in that role. And so I don't color it in all the way, but I color it in pretty far, right? And so you can decide how far you're going to color it in, but go ahead and take a moment to do that. Okay, I'm sorry. Sure, yeah, so I'll say it one more time. So on the outside of the flower, you're going to put whichever group in the category that you have. So whatever petal of the flower it is, like in this case, we're talking about gender. On that petal, who has the power? Write that on the outside of that petal. And so for gender, right, at least in my context, men have the power, and I put cisgendered men, right? Or who has the power. And people who make decisions typically have power, right? In a church context, you might think it might be the rector, or maybe it's the senior warden. Let me also say, though, the altar guild has a lot of power. If you anger the altar guild, you can show up and you might have an unfitting alb set out for you to put on. Okay, so who has the power? And then from the center of the petal outward, if you look on the picture, you're going to draw out to fill in about how much power you have. If you just have a little bit of power, only color in a little bit. If you have all the power, color in all the way to the edge. Is that more clear now? Yeah? Okay. All right. And the idea, obviously, is we all are flowers, and we are all made up of these different petals, and the petals are infinite, right? I've just listed some common ones here. But the idea is that you would do this for all those different petals. So do one for the geography you live in, right? Phoenix and Tucson probably have most of the power in our state. If you're in Flagstaff, is that where it is? Way out there somewhere? Is that Flagstaff? Okay. Anyway, if you're somewhere really rural, you might not have a lot of power for geography, right? Under education, maybe folks with a PhD might have more power than those that don't, okay? So thinking about, that's kind of the idea. And so when you look at your flower as a whole, look at how much power you have, because maybe you might not have power as a person of color, but you may have power as a man, or as someone who speaks English, or as someone who is ordained. And then think about that as you're entering and building relationships with folks, and how are you trying to share power with the people that you work with. And there's a whole nother piece to this, and that is you cannot judge the whole flower by looking at one petal. And for so often, we are judged by only one of our petals. I don't know how many times I've been judged by only one of mine, but yet we are all beautiful bouquets with lots of petals and beautiful flowers, right? Okay, so use this tool. I'm happy to talk with you more about it if this activity was confusing for you, but use it. Okay. This is called the People's Theory. It was developed from the Cultural Wellness Center, and on the left, it basically says, as you lose your culture, as you lose your community, you lose your health. And that's the downward process. On the right is the upward process. As you build community, as you engage in relationships with others, as you learn more about your culture, you will gain your health, and your community will be healthy. And so the next few slides I'm going to talk about are about culture. What is culture? Water in the fishbowl, thank you. It's what you live in, yeah. Some people struggle with it, and it's kind of like asking Cleo here, what is water? Cleo's gonna say, it's this stuff, I don't know. It's around me, I don't know. That's how most people might talk about their culture, right? If you take Cleo out of the water, then Cleo will tell you an awful lot about it. It keeps my scales wet. I need it to be buoyant. I need it to breathe, all of that stuff. And the same is true of culture. The best way you can learn about your own culture is to leave your own culture, try and get far, far away and live with some other culture, and you will learn a lot different things. When I left my reservation, lived with other natives, I thought we all did naming ceremonies the way that we did it. Oh no. I thought we all did blah, blah, blah like that. Oh no. I thought every family yelled at each other at Thanksgiving. Oh no. Every culture is a little different, right? And I'm sure you've seen this, the idea of that. What we see of a culture is just what's above, floating above the water, right? But the deeper part, the bigger part of our culture is all underneath. And that's why it's so important to build relationships. So if you pick a culture, you sometimes pick Chinese culture. What do you think of when you think of Chinese culture? Family. Smart. Respect, okay. Work, hard workers, okay. None of you are saying the things that I'm used to hearing, but that's good. Most people say the F words, not that F word, but the F words. Food, festivals, and fun. Chinese New Year, Chinese food, dragons, or something like that. So we often, above the water, we only see these things that are just outward facing. We don't see all these deeper things like where this idea of family comes from, or where the idea of conflict resolution comes from. How do we resolve conflict? How many genders are there? What is the role of the different genders in the community? Those things take time to develop and think about and see. If you're building relationships, you have to take time to do that. Otherwise, we might judge and not see. Anthropologists that came to Indian country, when we would travel, the men would ride on the horses and the women would walk. And what they said was, oh, well, that's because women aren't valued in our culture. That's not true. Actually, women made the decisions in our culture. And in fact, if you are married, if we wanted to divorce our husbands, we would just put your stuff outside the teepee and there, you're divorced. That's how it worked. The reason why men were on the horses and the women were walking is because if we got attacked, the men needed the energy to be able to fight. That's why we did it that way. Also, by the way, elders and people who couldn't walk were on the horses too. But if you don't take the time to figure it out, you don't see the full picture. You're only judging based on what you see above the water. Okay. There are 3 dimensions of culture. There's actually way more than that, but I'm going to talk about 3 of them because I think they're important. As you're learning about folks and learning about different cultures, and often we only notice our own. Somebody named Gert Hofstede developed these, not me. First one is individualism and collectivism. In an individual culture, which is most of America, the individual is more important than the group. And so that's why you see it in our theology too. People talk about a personal relationship with God. You see how you are in relationship with God, but not necessarily how you, plural, are in relationship with God. And so a lot of collectivistic cultures, that's where the group is more important than the individual. How they pray and what they think about prayer looks different. We might pray, one person is allowed then to pray for the whole group in that type of culture. And that's how we do Sundance. Sundancers, the one Sundancer sacrifices so that the other people may be healthy. They come to support the Sundancer, but only the one of them has to do it. And so when groups are making decisions, if they're from a collectivistic culture, you better believe you have to think about the whole collective as you work that out. And if you're from an individualistic culture, only the one person might need to make a decision. But if you're going and doing a hospital visit, for example, and you're from a collectivistic culture, the person who's on the bed might not be the person that's making the decision about their health. It might actually be a grandma or auntie or somebody like that. This one's another one that I think is really important, and it's a high context versus low context messaging. So on the right is a high context, or a low context message, I'm sorry. In a low context culture, the point of communication is to deliver information. It's what I'm doing with you now. I'm delivering information. And if you see that message on the right, if you can read English, you'll know what that says, right? It's telling you that the liquid inside is probably hot, well, or we assume it's liquid inside, right? On the left is a high context message. And it's actually a migration story about a family coming to the United States and generations and folks dying and children being born and all of that. But to understand that as a story or understand that message, you have to have a high level of context to know what that message is. Okay. In a high context culture, the point of communication is not necessarily to deliver information. The point of communication is to build relationship. I'm going to say it one more time because it's really important. In a high context culture, the point of communication is to build relationship. And so that's going to change how your interaction is going to go. And I know Anthony Guillen talks about this sometimes. That's the Latino missioner. He'll say, if you ask somebody how they came to church and they're like not Latino, they might say, oh, well, I drove here on I-29 or whatever and I got here. If you ask Latino how they came to church, they're going to tell you all the story about their family and how they came to, it's going to be a lot longer conversation. But again, that's that high context culture. They're telling you the story because they're trying to build a relationship with you, and that's the whole point of talking. Indians were very high context too. And so think about, as you're communicating with folks, if you think someone's talking a lot, sometimes it's because they're trying to build a relationship, not just because they're trying to deliver information. Examples of high context messages that we use in the United States, because we are a little bit high context, but not really. If I were I'm over at Jennifer's house and we're having dinner and we're talking after dinner and I say, well, I suppose, what am I saying? time to leave. That's a high context message. If I just said, I suppose, you might think I'm thinking of something. But if you understand the context, I'm telling you it's part of the 18-step Midwestern leaving process. I don't know if y'all have that in Arizona, but we have it here. Okay. And this other one is short and long-term orientation. How do we think about time? What is long-term? What is long-term? 20 years. Okay, great. Generations, right? Yeah. As a Lakota person, we're taught to think 7 generations into the future. And for, I know in management class or something I took, they were saying that in an institution, long-term is anything over 6 months. And so as you think about your congregations or the people you're working with, if they're from a long-term oriented culture, they're going to be thinking in a very different way about how they're managing their money, how they're doing budgets. All that stuff is going to be a very different process. And if you're in a short-term culture, they might not be thinking about that. Our government definitely is a short-term culture government most of the time, right? They're like, we're going to spend this budget right now, and da-da-da-da, we have a little extra, what are we going to spend it on? Let's give that back in tax. Okay, let me not be political. But anyway, you will see some different things that happen when we think that way. But it's important to understand where that comes from. There's one caveat here that I'm going to tell you, and that is no matter what, whether you're short-term or long-term culture, if you are in a community that is experiencing poverty, it will make you a short-term culture no matter what. And it does that. Our churches do that too. Our churches sometimes have the scarcity mindset and they're in poverty, and so they will not think in the long term and they'll eat away at their endowment or whatever it might be, right? They don't always think that way. So just know that happens. If you're in poverty, a lot of things happen, right? As Indian people, we're supposed to care for the land. That's inherent in, I heard that a lot. And then, some of the reservations, guess what? We use disposable plates and plasticware at our events. And I was like, wow, that's really wasteful. Guess what? The churches that do that don't have running water. Some of them have outhouses. Makes you think about it a little differently. Okay. This is something called the communication gap. This happens all the time, thousands of times every day. It's probably happened at least 50 times since I started talking. Person A has a thought. It's private and known only to them. And my thought is, let's get you on this road to reconciliation. But anyway, this is, okay. They have a system of encoding that thought that is based on their life experiences, their upbringing, all of these different things. And from that encoding, they will have an action. That's the thing that they're going to do to help transmit that information. The people that the information is being transferred to, they have their own system of decoding based on their culture, based on their upbringing, based on their life experiences. And they will have their own thought. And the difference between person A's thought and person B's thought is the communication gap. And the more different you are, the more likely that's going to happen, right? True story. In high school, I had a friend. His name was Phi. He's Vietnamese. He invited me over for dinner. We had pho. It was very delicious. His mom's cook. I wanted to say thank you, and I have a system of encoding. In my family, when someone cooks dinner and they do a good job or whatever, you say thank you by clearing the table and doing the dishes. So after dinner, I wanted to say thank you, and I began to pick up the bowls and bring them into the kitchen. Phi's mom had her own system of decoding, and I will tell you, when I began to pick up the bowls, she started yelling very loudly in Vietnamese. I have no idea what she said. And her son said, "Just stop." What message do you think she was getting? It's definitely an insult, yes. I thought that she was such a terrible host that I had to take it upon myself to clear the table because she took too long to do it. Again, a good example of the communication gap. Another time I got invited for Chinese New Year, and I was like, can I bring anything? And he's like, bring flowers. And of course, I'm in high school, so I'm cheap. And I brought carnations, which I do love. They smell good. And I was like, well, what should I bring? And I'm sitting there in the store, and I was like, well, we don't want to bring red because I don't want her to think that I'm in love with her son. And I was like, I will just get white because white is peaceful. And who doesn't like peace? Somebody already, okay, yeah, I hear the groans. All right. So I show up, open the door, and of course he looks at the flowers and he's like, oh my gosh. And then he says something to his mom. His mom says something back. And she's like, it's okay. And she comes running down and puts them in a vase and puts them in front of, well, let me not tell you. White's the color you bring when people die. That's flower. Okay. So she puts them in a vase and puts them in the corner where they have like their little altar for their ancestors and stuff. So they got to sit there. So it was, but in her culture, it's also about saving face. So she helped me save face because I had done this faux pas, right? Okay. And that brings me to this. As we're engaging in this work, as we're going out and building relationships and meeting people, I like to use this bucket analogy. The more we are building relationships, the more water gets put in the bucket. And in the course of being in relationship with people, you're going to be carrying this bucket and it's going to be wobbly. And sometimes you do something like bring white flowers on Chinese New Year, and that's when you kind of tip the bucket and some water spills out. And as long as there is water in that bucket, your relationship will be okay. Know that that bucket's going to spill from time to time. And so it's important that you have lots of water in there. And the more water you have in there, the more you can push. So for example, I'm trying to think of a good example. If I'm doing something wrong and somebody wants to push me really hard, if I have a good relationship, I'm going to hear their message a little differently than I might hear it from somebody who I don't know at all, right? I can push them a little harder. Think about the relationships you have in church. If you heard something from a parishioner you just met versus if you heard somebody from a parishioner who's been there, generations or something, you're going to hear those two things differently, right? And they could push a little harder. Okay. I don't know if you've seen this model before. I think it was developed by Beverly Tatum. How many of you know what a moving walkway is? Okay, it's like a flat escalator you stand or walk on in the airport, right? Okay. Moving walkway, like in an airport, yeah. Okay. So our society is like this. Right now our society is like sexist and racist and homophobic and ableist and all of the ists. And so it's moving in this direction of oppression. And we're all on this moving walkway. And if some people are on it, like this person, and they know that they have privilege. And so they just walk in that direction to take full advantage of that privilege. That's this person. And then there's this is probably some of us here, right? We're on this walkway and we all have baggage, right? Because I got broken up with Sam in 6th grade and I haven't gotten over it yet or whatever, right? We all have baggage. And if we do nothing, if we just stand on that walkway, we are part of the problem because it's still going to push us by virtue of just being in society. For every $1 I make, an equally qualified woman makes, I don't remember what, it used to be 70 cents. Now I think it's 85. But I'm still getting that advantage if I do nothing, right? And what is my responsibility if I'm getting this unearned privilege? And so some people will be on this walkway and they recognize it. Other people will be like, what's going on? Why is it that my cousin, who's a lot darker than me, gets followed in the store and I don't? And they'll be like, huh. Other people are like, oh no, that's discrimination. That's racism. And some people, that's where they stop. There's this great book called I think it's called The Great Dog Poop Initiative. And it's like there's the people who point at the dog poop and like, there's dog poop there, don't step in it. That's helpful, right? We don't want to step in dog poop. But what's more helpful is if you pick it up and move it, right? And so there's scoopers and there's pointers, and you have to decide, are you going to be a pointer or a scooper, right? And that's the book. I think every vestry needs to read that book. It's a children's book, but feel free to, they didn't give me anything to say that, I'm sorry, but okay. And then some people are like, somebody should do something about this. There's racism in our church. Somebody should do something about it. Somebody, right? Okay, and some people, that's where they are. And then there's these people who are like, I don't even see color. So I'm half white and half Native. My white grandma, that's what she used to say. Bless her heart, she's in heaven now. Love her to death. Her and I disagreed on so many political things. She's Missouri Synod Lutheran. Her favorite thing was, I just don't even see color. I don't even know my black friend Janice is black. Well, Grandma, one, she wouldn't be your black friend Janice, who has never been to her house, by the way. She only sees this lady at church, but she's her black friend Janice. If you didn't know she was black, she wouldn't be your black friend Janice. And if I had $1, I was like somebody's gay friend Shaneequa. I could go on a vacation. All right, anyway, so that's some people. They just choose to ignore, but that walkway's still gonna move. And then if you want to actually create change, you have to actively work against it, which is what we're doing here, which is why you are here. But if you just think it's an event and you're like, oh, I got this certification, now I went through that anti-racism training, oh, I did Safe Church, whatever. If you don't continually do it, that walkway is gonna move you right back and push you back. And so we have to realize that it's not an event, it's a process, and you have to continuously be active to change it. Oh, we're not doing bad, okay. So I'm gonna ask you to do an activity. At your tables, what I'd like you to do is take, let's say about 5 minutes, and I want you just to think about these questions and talk about them. Pick any, you don't have to pick one question per table, you can talk about any one of those 3. But the questions are, what assumptions do you bring to healing and reconciliation that may impact how you relate to others? Those questions are not the ones that are on the table, they are on the screen. Those are for later. What cultural practices do you use to support your ministry? Or, what are some concrete first steps you, individually, or you, collectively, can take on the journey to right relationship? So just take about 5 minutes and visit, and you're not in your churches, which is great, so you can say things and be honest. Can you turn the house lights up? take about 1 more minute. All right. Take a moment to finish your thought and then come back to the group. I hope you all had at least heard some new ideas or discussed something. All right. So I'm going to move to the next sort of thing. This is the table discussions. And I'm going to talk about storytelling. All right. One of the ways that we can build relationships is through story. And that's also one of the ways that we can create change. And I remember someone telling me, if you want to change, you need to move people's heads and their hearts. And this is when I was an epidemiologist. And they said, data are what move people's heads. So we can tell them blah, blah, blah % of the population has diabetes. But if we tell them a story about a specific person who has diabetes, who maybe had to have some sort of, kidney dialysis because their kidneys gave out, that will change them differently. And stories move people's hearts. And so if you want to create change, you need to move people's heads, data, hearts, stories. And if you want to build a relationship, stories do that too. So why, I gave you 2 reasons why story is important, but why else is story important? We're made for it. Yes, that's actually my top one. We are hardwired for story. Did I plant you? We are hard. Why else? Sharing yourself. Yes. Yes. Letting people know who you are. Sorry, I need to repeat what everybody says because you might not be able to hear them. My apologies. Yes, walk someplace you wouldn't otherwise. We can, helps us construct meaning. Yes. It's memorable. It creates community. One more time. Everybody has stories. Yes. It helps us create change, empowerment. Yes, in the back. Stories are more interesting. Yes. Yeah, I've learned that if I do a sermon, I'm like, the Greek root of that word is blah, 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 blah. The congregation is just like, whoop. If you tell them a story, sometimes they'll stay engaged, right? This last one is important too. Stories are anamnetic. And that's a fancy word. I know, I won't tell you the Greek, but somebody who's been to seminary, what does anamnetic mean? Remembering, it's where we get the word amnesia, right? And there's an anamnetic statement we make in the Eucharist. Christ has died, Christ has risen, Christ will come again. It's a deep remembering, a remembering so deeply that you make something present again. Stories are like that. If I'm telling the story about, I don't know, whatever situation, I can remember it so deeply that it's like it's there, like I'm there. And I will laugh and you will laugh because it's almost like you're there with me. Other things are anamnetic too. Recipes are anamnetic, right? If I'm cooking my grandma's whatever, wojapi, like some berry pudding, I I can hear her telling me, like, now keep stirring because you don't want to let it scorch on the bottom, or whatever, as I'm making it. And it's like she's there with me again. So why might you tell your story? It's the one you know best. Well, create relatability. Creates permission. Okay. I have a couple here. There's some internal ones. Healing, empowerment, along with what you all have said. You are the expert of your own story. Somebody else said that already. And there's some external one. Creating visibility. Balancing of voices. Maybe it's about leaving a legacy. Maybe it's about reconciliation. You can find common ground. Yeah. So as we tell our stories, as we think about these stories, and know that we have lots and lots of stories. It's not like one story. It's like, how the Bible is not a book? A Bible is like a library, right, with a bunch of books in it. Stories are the same way. We have lots of different stories. Some things that I want you to think about. And I remember I told this one at Deputies of Color, and there was like this hush that came over the room. Think about your audience. Who are you telling this story to? And then whose story is being told in their perspective. And this is what I'm going to tell you. If you are from the African diaspora or a black person and you are reading, well, what is this picture of, first of all? The Exodus. If you are reading the Exodus, who are you in that story? The Israelites, right? The Israelites leaving slavery in Egypt and coming to the promised land, right? As an indigenous person, I can read that same story from Exodus. Who am I in that story? The Canaanite. And, right. Who said that? I heard the oh. That's exactly what happened the other time when I talked about this. Right, we don't realize that. It is the same story. But if you have a different perspective, you are going to hear it very differently. And that Canaanite story was used to justify the taking of our land in North America as Europeans came over and colonized, along with doctrine of discovery, blah, blah, blah. Okay, I shouldn't say blah, blah. It's very bad. Okay, so think about that. And I'm going to tell you two different story structures. This is sort of the standard one, right? We have this beginning moment, the time where we're going to talk about who's in the story. I was at the store with my friend Jennifer, and we were going to get chocolate because it is convention. I don't know. Awesome, right. And then there's like an inciting incident. Something happens. And when we open the door, it was locked. Right? And so there was rising action. Where are we going to get our chocolate? And at some moment, there's a climax, whatever that might be. We went to the other store, and it was open, and all they had was chocolate, and it was her favorite. I don't know. And then you have falling action, what happens after the climax, right? And then there's the conclusion, like they lived happily ever after or whatever. But between the inciting incident and the resolution, you will experience transformation of whatever the characters are in the story. This is like the standard storytelling, whatever. At least the Western one. Here's another example of story structure that's often used in indigenous communities, some other ones, some Asian communities use this kind of storytelling model. And it's we're going to tell a story in the middle, and we're going to keep kind of coming around, and there'll be like a recurring thing that comes around every time. I know some people preach like that. They might preach and be like, can I get an amen? And blah, blah, blah. Okay, but you're going to come back to this recurring theme. And an example of a story like this that you've all hopefully heard, maybe you haven't, is Goldilocks and the Three Bears. Goldilocks came in the house and found the chairs, and one was too big, too small, just right. She found the porridge, and it was too hot, too cold, perfect. She lay down on the bed, and it was too hard, too soft. Okay, so you all know this storytelling model. This is another way of doing it, and that's the okay way too. Okay, there's not one right way of doing it, just like there's not one right way of doing reconciliation. There's one wrong way of doing it, which is not doing it at all. So now I'm going to have us take some time to work on your stories. And each of you, there are some index cards on your table, and I'd like you to each take one index card. And there should be a sheet that says BBC, which stands for Building Beloved Community, story prompts. Oh yeah, can we turn up the house lights? I don't know who has control of the lights, but turn them on so people can see what they're writing. The rest of the slides are not that sexy, so you can just... Are we working on it? We got it? Oh, we cannot turn on the lights. Oh, okay. We will work on it. Hopefully we can turn the lights on soon. All right. On the sheet of paper are some prompts, and I'll have some on the screen, so if you don't, because there's only like 2 sheets of paper on each table, what I'd like you to do is on the index card, and there's a specific reason why I'm using these index cards. On the index card, I would like you to write about, and you can pick any one of these, a time you experienced or witnessed racism in the life of the church. Or a time you felt welcome or valued as a person of color or as fully yourself if you're not a person of color. Or a time you saw beloved community coming to life or being created. Or a moment you experienced healing or transformation around race. And healing can mean you were made aware of it. Or a specific thing you would see, and so this is asking you to imagine, a specific thing you would see when the dream of beloved community occurs. And there might be a couple more options on the sheets of paper that are there, but we're going to take, about 6 minutes. And so 6 minutes to write to ourselves, not to visit with our neighbors. But we're going to take about 6 minutes. So go ahead and do that now to answer one of those questions. Take about 1 more minute. 1 more minute. Okay. So if you can hear me, clap your hands once. Thank you. Okay. Some of you already started doing this, so you're already way ahead of the curve. You're already just doing great. What I want you to do is at your tables, we're going to take about, let's say the next 10, 11 minutes. I want you don't have to. So if you wrote something really personal and you don't want to share it, but the good news is you're with people you don't know, probably, at least not people from your church, what I want you to do is tell people what you wrote down. Share your story with folks at your table. Tell them what you wrote down. You can pass if you want, but take the next 11 minutes to do that. You don't have to tell them the whole background. We know that you might have written notes instead of wrote, verbatim, but share. All right, take 11 minutes, share. 2 more minutes. 2 more minutes. Thirty more seconds. Okay. I hope you all had an opportunity to hear from at least some folks on your table. I'd like you to, if you heard a story that helped you connect with somebody else, raise your hand. Okay. If you heard a story that helped you connect with someone else, raise your hand in some way, shape, or form, okay? Awesome. If you think you could tell this story again in some other context, maybe at your congregation or something else, raise your hand. Okay, did anybody have the experience where you read these questions and couldn't think of anything and so you didn't write anything down? Couple? Yeah. That does happen sometimes, so don't feel bad. Did anybody have the experience where when I gave you time, you suddenly had a very strong connection and pull from the Holy Spirit to your cell phone and was checking your emails? Nobody. Somebody here is not being truthful. But anyway, okay, moving on. Another tool that you can use is this one. It's a haiku. And who here knows what a haiku is? Wow, okay. It's a form of poetry. And the way it works is there are, I'll give you an example. Here's one. There are 5 syllables in the first line, and a syllable is like the beats of the words, if that makes sense. So like syllable has 3 syllables in it. Shaneequa. Episcopal has 4, right? Okay. So it should have 5 syllables, and the next line 7 syllables, and the next line 5 syllables. And then to be a true haiku, it needs to have a seasonal reference. Doesn't have to have the season in it, but so this example here, the hummingbirds come, sucking nectar in my view, bringing joy this day. And so the seasonal reference is that the hummingbirds have come. It's the time when they're there. Okay. The reason why I want you to try this is for some people, this is actually easier than writing a story. And for other people, it helps to condense their thoughts into a more powerful story. So I was doing this in a group with some indigenous folks, and a friend talked about her friend who had passed away. And I'm going to read you hers. And it was like, it just drew you right there. Like in a short period of time, you were connected with her and her story. And this is actually how she began her story. She lived, loved, and died. Cindy was my role model. In winter, she left. And it was just, whoomp, right? It just brings you right there. You can connect, right? So what I'd like you to do now is take 5 minutes, or maybe 4, and I want you to try and write a haiku with the story that you wrote on the index card. And there's plenty of index card if you need to try again. The reason why we use index cards is because you don't want a story too long. So that's why I didn't give you a lot of space. So take your time. And it's okay to use your fingers to count the syllables. Count the syllables. Take some time. Okay, if you haven't figured it out yet, I'm going to ask you to share your haiku. Well, first of all, How many of you got a haiku done? Awesome. How many of you did not get a haiku? All right, a few of you. All right, you still have time to work on it. How many of you used your fingers to count the syllables? Wonderful. All right, awesome. All right. What I'd like you to do is share your haikus with each other at the table, and that will lead us into being almost over. So after that, we'll come back for a second, and then we'll be done. Share your haiku. All right. If you can come back to the room. So what I'd like to leave you with are these questions. As a Lakota person, people are always talking when we talk. That just happens in Indian country at funerals and things. People are like, so it doesn't bother me at all. So think about these questions. Where could we use storytelling in our communities? Is it a tool for like evangelism? And by evangelism, I mean relationship building, not with the intention necessarily of converting anybody. Is it a tool for building relationship? Is it a tool for reconciliation? Is it all of those things? Where and how can we use them? I would love to see y'all do some workshop like this in your congregations. And then who needs to hear our story? Or who needs to hear your story? Or one of your stories? Who needs to hear the story that you wrote down? Okay. And with that, I'm going to end because we're out of time. But the last thing I just want to say is there is a labyrinth. If you want more information about some of the work that we do in the reconciliation, justice, and creation care, or learn more about Beloved Community, you can visit www.episcopalchurch.org/beloved-community. Thank you very much, and I hope you have a good rest of your convention.
We don't have to turn off the lights again. It's okay. Like, I know there's like one person who can turn the lights on and off. Or maybe, actually, no, you're right. We do because of what's next. So thank you, Laurel. So thank you so much, Shaneequa, for giving us stories today, giving us poetry, and giving us insights and stories that I think hopefully we will take back to our congregations and share with them. And Shaneequa will be here tomorrow and at Eucharist, so there is more time to meet with her and ask her questions. So she's friendly. You may have gathered that. So thank you. Next, we are going to, so in 2000 and, what year is it? In 2020, which is not this year, we did an online convention. At that convention, as part of sort of launching our new anti-racism training, we did a survey of people who attended convention about what experience they had had in anti-racism or anti-bias work, and we want to redo that survey today to see what's happened over the last 2 years in terms of if there has been growth, if there's been progress. So we have here a QR code, so you can put your phone up, take a picture of that, and it will send you to the survey. If you don't have the capacity to do that, there are polling stations on either side that have iPads at them, along with people to help you, where you can do the survey there. When you are done with your survey, you are free to move about the cabin and free to roam. Evening prayer is at 5 o'clock. The reception starts at 5:30, I believe. And so you are on your own to do those things as you see fit. But please do the survey so that we can compare where we were 2 years ago with where we are today.
Where's the reception?
The reception is down that hall at the end of the hall. Sorry? There's inside and outside.